Alright, YouTube, before I get into the meat and bones of this next occult video, someone requested that I do another one, so I figured, what the hell, I'll do one tonight. Fruits of Eden, Herbalism and the Occult, not forbidden fruit, as chaosis. The Fruits of Eden, Herbalism and the Occult, I have begun editing it, I've begun illustrating it. I promised to have it done by the end of summer. It's September, summer is beginning to wane away. I've gotten the first chapter done as well as the table of contents, started some sketches. I don't know exactly what day it will be done, but I'm going through it as quickly as possible while making sure to do a good job. Basically, I'm proofreading through it, remove all spelling errors, if any, grammatical mistakes. I'm adding some content to it. I'm changing one of these sections somewhat, and I'm adding additional content to it as I go. I can get through probably 20-30 pages per day in this manner. It'll take at least a week to do all the illustrations to any level of sophistication. My setup now for doing those is better, so that will be done soon, and I'll be making an update probably tomorrow on some of the works that I've been editing, all in one video. I'll also be making a blog post on my books blog as well as my regular blog, the Hail the Werewolf blog, which has been inactive for a while on that topic. And the fact that I had gotten the first chapter done today actually leads to this video. This was not a topic that I was going to originally discuss. I had some other occult topics I wanted to cover. The concept of a difference between, I guess you could put it, rural and urban occultism. That is the sort of paganist outlands occultism of what we might think of as folkish individuals, or in the antiquated period we would think of them as literal outlanders, someone living on the fringes of a kingdom or empire, people living in a small village as opposed to an urban center of commerce or something along those lines. In the modern day, the difference between the types of occult materials, stories, folklore, spells and rituals, whatever you want to term it, that you would encounter within an urban environment, specifically someone born and raised in an urban environment or people thereof, and people from the countryside, people from some other place. I think that this is most important, especially in the modern era. Unless you're going back into antiquity, I think that this takes on a whole new paradigm within the occult in the modern era, because the internet fairly quickly, we're talking mid-1990s, emerges as a force to be reckoned with, including within the occult, within urban centers. Only thereafter do the rural areas really gain access to any great degree. Until fairly recently, I think I've spoken of this, the Northeast Kingdom in my state still had dial-up. Until I think 2009 or 2010, they were using dial-up. I think it was around 2001 before the village that I used to live in when I was younger got hooked up to the internet as far as being publicly accessible in the library. This side of Vermont, as the more urban side, had it, we're talking mid to late 90s, they had fairly good internet hookups. But you would look at a city like New York City, you would expect the kinds of ritualism used by an occultist there to be vastly different, perhaps, than somebody from 100 miles away, even within the same general geographic zone, in the same nation, in the same state in many cases, who nonetheless they live in the middle of nowhere. I think there's a great difference between the two. In Fruits of Eden, I touched upon this. I've expanded this part of the first chapter substantially because I think it's so important. With the occult today, especially with the internet, you have a much wider availability of occult literature than you've ever had at any point in the past. Because now a person in Kenya can translate a document originally written in Latin, and somebody in Nepal can download it. This was never possible before the age of the internet. Before that, people were limited physically to books and materials that they themselves could physically access at their library, at a local museum, at a bookstore, something like that. You may be able to mail order things, but then what about Does your area even have like mail order catalogs? I think the occult is expanding still. And this renaissance isn't going anywhere for the next 10 to 20 years. There are still plenty of parts of this world that have relatively little internet access, relatively little connection with the outside world. The internet is picking up steam in parts of Africa, especially the Ivory Coast and sort of the southeast coastal regions, up into Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, those regions in Eastern Africa, even like Somalia now. Eastern Europe is now getting more and more hooked up. Russia, China at some point may, abandon their intranet in favor of at least a partially open internet system. We've seen parts of Southeast Asia. You would think the Philippines, Taiwan, places like that have really opened up to the internet world more so than in the past. Originally, it's basically, you're talking about a chunk of Western Europe, parts of the United States, and not even all. Australia, and then Canada, you're talking about basically the Anglosphere and other parts of Western Europe. And it is now exploding. It's blossoming into a much larger size. As that happens, texts and materials and inscriptions and engravings and photographs and everything else you can possibly think of floods onto the collective market online with wider availability. For instance, and this isn't just straight out occult material. Think of something like incense, like an occult trapping or robes or something. You can now get them imported from, parts of Africa via an independent eBay seller or something like that. I had some incense from Ghana that I got years ago. It was actually among the best incense blends that I'd ever tried. Very fragrant, very well made. Certainly better than most of what you would get sort of imported in the little cardboard boxes from India, mass-produced, the Nag Champa or whatever. What has happened is that the internet, though, despite increasing the corpus of occult literature available to people and occult materials available to people to study, you're talking Renaissance or medieval era works that for the first time are being translated into a modern format, an electronic format, or a new release, or even for the first time into a Western language or something. Despite that, there is also a wedge driven between urban and rural occultism, in that the urban occultist, somebody living in a tenement in New York City, or they're living in Tokyo, they don't have forests, wildlife around. They don't have wilderness around. They may not have a place they can raise occult species or really observe even astronomy. You would think in a large city, you look up at the sky, you probably see the North Star, and that's about it. And the moon, if the moon happens to be out. You can't really see all the other constellations, even here where I am, in a relatively rural area. We don't have the same sky that you would get in the Mojave Desert, or far northern Canada, or the middle of Siberia, or the Sahara Desert or something. This is the difference between rural and urban occultism, and it roughly mirrors antiquity. You would think about the term paganus itself as applied to the Roman Empire. You've got a big difference between the sort of magical, mystic, occult traditions practiced by somebody who was living in Rome or in Alexandria or someplace like that. It tended to be more legalistic, hands-off, more studious. It was more about studying. You're reading books and scrolls and codices and so forth, and you have like your little telescope or whatever looking up at the stars, as opposed to the outlands people who are dancing and drinking and taking hallucinogens and wearing bear furs and stuff like that. There's a difference between the two types of occultism. The only other time really in history that we see such a pronounced difference between the two is mid-antiquity. The Roman Empire, maybe the Greek Empire, the Persians or something. Before that, you don't necessarily have that aspect. You have a rudimentary spiritual system controlled by some priesthood like you had in Egypt. The lay people had a very clearly delineated system. Yes, there were local cults. There were local tribal groups that venerated one deity above the other. This happened in Greece. This happened in Persia, yes. But at the same time, it was different. In the antiquated period, sort of the height of civilization back then in the Iron Age, we're talking the height of the Roman Empire, you have that very legalistic aspect to the point where the religion and the state become basically the same thing. You have the emperor cults and things like that. Somebody living in the middle of the Italian peninsula, circa 250-300 AD, would have had a very different outlook on the spiritual system they were using than somebody at the very fringes, somewhere like in the middle of Dacia or outer what's now Iran or something like that. Somebody on the very fringes probably had much more autonomy when it came to their spiritual system. You have the same today. People who are largely absorbing their material and speaking about it online may feel more compelled, I believe, than somebody practicing on their own out in a small town or a village somewhere or in the middle of the forests, compelled to join a specific sort of mindset. They do not necessarily possess any actual hands-on occult skills whatsoever that can't be performed with things that they would purchase. That's the other difference, the monetary difference. Yes, the urbanite may have more money, but they're going to be shelling out to buy all these things because they're not growing their own herbs, they're not creating their own incense probably because they can't really make charcoal. What exactly are they supposed to do? They're going to be buying it largely online. Therein, the internet again. All of these things are now available to everybody basically for, in some cases, in some of these cultures, what would be the first time. You go back to the 60s and you think of the New Age mystic occultism of that era. Unless you're living in San Francisco or a few of these other places, you're kind of left out. You don't necessarily have access to the kinds of written materials even that would be produced. You would think of, I've actually got a few of these in my collection. You would think of some self-published little booklet that 100 copies were printed. It never appeared again anywhere in print. I've got a booklet from the 1930s. It's only about 14 pages long. It's a pamphlet. I can't remember even who wrote it. It's basically a sort of Christian theosophical fusion tract about meditation and ruminating on a few of the aspects of, I guess, the Christian deity. And you look it up, you'll find an obituary for the person who wrote it and a very brief mention of what the manuscript is. You're not going to find it for sale. It's never been reprinted. I don't think there's a printing service on earth that would be willing to print something that short. Amazon won't do it. I've wanted to release this same work bundled with something else specifically because it's a very rare text to my knowledge. You're talking about something that was largely printed up for apparently some sort of civic organization almost 100 years ago by one author so-called who only did this one work, probably given out to friends and family mostly, and then never again. Some sort of vague theosophist from the Los Angeles area, or Joel of Arcadia, who I think is still alive. He's sort of like a cult leader. He wandered around out in the Mojave and stuff and thought he was Jesus. Produced a few literary materials. You would think of Ekankar or any of these other things. Some of these writings wouldn't really be available to anyone if it weren't for the internet. They're infrequently available as far as the physical copies go from those same periods. They're frequently available in electronic format. And at the same time, and this is the unfortunate part, while the internet has increased the occult in manifold ways, the occult has grown larger, the corpus of literature has grown larger, the availability of goods has grown larger, public acceptance of the occult. In some of these cultures where people weren't, like you think the Protestant outlands of the United States or some parts of Europe or something, or Russia, where people don't really like witchery and stuff and they think it's evil and it makes you go to hell, those cultures have gained a wider acceptance of such things to an extent. Not necessarily all of them. They still wouldn't like it if you were showing them your jet black leather-bound grimoire all about, summoning Azazel or something, but at the same time, they'll sort of tolerate Wicca, and they'll sort of tolerate Hermetics or something like that, or Gnosis. One of these other philosophical or mystic traditions, they may tolerate it to a greater extent. And most of these things, most people wouldn't even know what the fuck they were if it weren't for the internet. Because honestly, television only went so far. The problem with television, this happened in the 70s and 80s, people are starting to learn about the occult. There's sort of a new wave post-Victorian era increase in the interest in archaeology and the paranormal and UFOs and all these things. You've got sci-fi writers pushing this stuff. You've got Chariots of the Gods. You've got all sorts of good stuff from that era. But here's the problem. The media, which controls television utterly, gets to push their own discourse on the topic. they can then muddy the waters. They can basically insinuate that these people are evil. Not so on the internet. On the internet, it's completely different. Anybody can start a blog and start completely disenfranchising and dissing the mainstream media and what they say about spirituality. What do you think I do? I use my YouTube channel to do the same thing when they try to restart the satanic panic. In this day and age, it's exactly the same, only this time they've completely fallen short and failed because of the internet. Back in the 80s, they had no problem. It was easy to run roughshod over those who actually represented a satanic view. They did the same with the Wiccans. They did the same with certain pagan groups. But then here's the problem. There's the rub. The urban and rural occultists have been largely driven apart. That is, if for every 1,000 self-published little tracts which profess to make you invisible or help you levitate, or here are 10 secret death curses from some tribe that may not even have ever existed. For every 1,000 of those works, you've got one sort of legitimate natural science track, something on herbalism or alchemy or something like that, something that would be, at least to my mind, more interesting, something more authentic, something more, in many cases, ancient. And therein you have the problem. The techno-occultist of the urban region, because they were not born in the wilderness, they may have never seen a wilderness. Their idea of a forest is Central Park or something. They don't really have those hands-on skills. They don't have an appreciation for growing things or studying minerals or any of the thing, or watching animals or trying to get a totemic spirit or any of the many things that would happen in a rural area. Likewise, the rural occultists are disenfranchised with their lackluster view of technology in some cases. You've got to realize there are plenty of people in this world still with a dial-up connection. They don't have the smartphone, they don't have the new laptop, they don't have, unlimited data or something like that. They have a relatively rudimentary access to certain types of technology, which really limits their capability to access these materials. You'd think somebody has a limited data plan and they're trying to download Renaissance era works that have been scanned and sort of recovered from ancient texts. That's eating up a lot of their data. They probably can't do that very often. They may not even have a platform to really read it properly on. Therein, you've got a problem. In the medieval era is the same, to a lesser extent, not necessarily as much as modern era or antiquity. We're really a lot like Rome at its height right now, as opposed to the sort of the Dark Ages or something like that, or even the High Renaissance in some ways. In the medieval era, you've got the same sort of interplay. A lot of the urban areas really had been depopulated by plague at that point, so you didn't have a lot of large centers of commerce the way you did at the height of the Roman Empire. So the roads are dilapidated, the forests closing in around these little towns and villages that used to be thriving, population's declining, and everything's going to shit, and everyone's worried they're going to die from the miasmas pretty soon. But at the same time, in medical treatment, you still have the same analogous situation. You have the witch, herbal healer, using powdered minerals and plants and stuff to cure ailments, and then you have what would have been then a mainstream surgeon who answered every problem with amputation or leeches. Big difference in the survivorship. The witch was rumored to have great power, probably, because in many cases more people survived such treatments. I pointed this out when Europeans at the time, and Middle Easterners to a lesser extent, persecuted people they saw as like sorcerers or something. Really, they declined their own cultures in doing so. They took the people that were actually skilled in medicine and philosophy and they persecuted them for several hundred years. Really, really good decision that they made there. It was kind of like at the height of the plague when they decided, oh, these cats are causing the plague, let's kill them. Oh shit, the plague got worse. I wonder why. Could it be the cats were killing off the rodents that were actually responsible for the plague by harboring fleas? Well, no shit. So therein you have again the same situation basically. But yes, urban and rural occultism are different. There's people I've spoken to that are involved with the occult in some way or another. It doesn't matter what specific kind of occultism they're involved in, if any at all, if any organized group. There is a difference between the mindset and sort of the goals and the means and the stuff bought or the stuff made between somebody who lives on the fringes of society and practices mysticism and somebody who lives in, again, New York City, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Shanghai, Moscow, someplace like that, Amsterdam. There's a big difference between the two. Folk legends are the same. The sort of urban legends that you get in a literal urban zone are going to be quite different. Usually they revolve around like some abandoned factory or a sanitarium or this hotel's elevator or the old subway line that got closed up because part of it collapsed. Those are the haunted places. Those are the places inhabited by goblins or extraterrestrials that are building underground bases or something. You go to a rural area, you still got the more classical cryptids. Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, something like that. You've got a big difference between the two in virtually every aspect, even in spirituality as a mainstream concept. Urban areas tend to be more of a melting pot of religion. They tend to be more secular as well. You go into the outer areas, that's not necessarily the case. Here in New England, the whole place is secular largely, but the church is often still sort of a civic center for the entire, very small, closely knit community. So you have that. You have a different culture entirely when it comes to all of these different things. I thought that this was an important thing to talk about. As for Fruits of Eden, again, I've begun to edit it, and so hopefully it'll be released fairly soon on Amazon. No more, I'm not working with publishers anymore, unless it's like one of my works is good enough to go to like the big five or something like that. That may be worth it. I'm not working with small publishers anymore. I'm not going to wait 2 or 3 years for a work to be released that I can release in a couple of months or less. It's just not going to happen. I'll do my own editing. I'll do my own illustrating. No offense to the people who did illustrations for my work. I thought they were very good, but I think I can work more quickly, and at least with Fruits of Eden, I don't want to combine like my art with the art of somebody else. It just wouldn't make any sense. It's probably faster to do my own as well. I don't know anything about SVG format or anything like that. I just render it myself using a scanner and then manipulate the images. It's a lot easier. Amazon does accept the images. It doesn't give an error warning. They are high enough DPI for me to do that without them looking, shitty, which is how some things on Amazon look. You look at these cheap, crappily photocopied pages. It's just the most monstrous, horrible thing you can possibly imagine if you're a bibliophile. I wish they did hardcover services, honestly. That's about all. Peace out.